talking about this relationship between media and theater. David Shumway will be here the week after from Carnegie Mellon, and he'll be talking about August Wilson and The Wire, to be determined. We also have an event planned with Robert Reed Farr, who's the newly appointed head of Gender and Sexuality Studies at Harvard. He's a former Edward Said chair, and he'll be talking about James Baldwin, and we're going to try to arrange a screening of this film, which is actually at the Human Rights Festival, which is entitled
I'm Not Your Negro.
I'm Not Your Negro. Thank you. And we're going to try to film that, screen that before Robert comes. And finally, Tim Raphael. Well, there are two other events. We're going to have a panel right after the U.S. election, which will be on November the 7th, the day after the election, to talk about it with a number of different people. And then in mid-November, hi, come in. Glad you found it. Great entrance. Okay, the other event that we'll have is with Tim Raphael from Newark, Rutgers, who runs a center called Newest Americans. Newark, New Jersey is one of the most diverse cities in the United States, and this project is all about immigration and will allow us to have a much larger conversation about one of the most significant issues in the United States. I would like to take this opportunity to also introduce our new program coordinator, Vanessa Breeding, who is over here. Many of you know her already. I'm so happy to see Greg, to see Sarin, to have Sari here. I'd like to emphasize that we're very open in terms of suggestions for programming, working together. Please let us know what you're interested in doing, what you think is important, and we will try to accommodate you. Also, Corrie Ismaili, if you have not met him, is the visiting professor of American Studies, Media Studies this year, and we're really happy to have him. He's going to be offering a course on Trump and Trumpism in the spring, in case you haven't got enough of him. Okay, I'll make the introductions relatively quick, in spite of the fact that I could go on for a very long time about the guests on the panel. I'm just going to start here with Sari Hanafi, who is a professor of sociology here, and he's the editor of Idafat, the Arab Journal of Sociology. Probably most significantly, he's the president of the International Sociological Association. He's the first Arab ever to hold that position, and Palestinian, I would assume. You can go on the website. He's also the chair of the Department of Sociology.
I was.
Okay. I invite you to take a look at his absolutely extraordinary output on the website of the sociology department, and we're really thrilled to have him here. He's worked in occupied territories extensively. His work spans a breadth of things, and I'm sure he'll talk about that when he talks about the play. The play, of course, that we're here to talk about is My Name is Rachel Corrie, and the person who's most responsible for bringing this all together is Rachel Valentine Smith, here a second from the end. She is the artistic direction of, it's The Faction?
The Faction.
Yeah, The Faction Theater, in London. When we did King Lear here a couple of years ago, we worked with them on that production. Sahar Assaf, who's here, who's the co-director of the theater initiative, also had appeared in one of their productions in London, Dario Fo play. So it's really wonderful to welcome you back. Again, I would send you to her credits, but I would say that what's really astounding is the breadth of the work. I think it's sort of true of everybody here on the panel, but as I said, we worked on King Lear, the Schiller Fest. This is something that Mark and Rachel, her collaborator at Faction Do, is big historical plays, bare-bones Shakespeare. They've gotten accolades, innumerable accolades in the press in London, and well-deserved. So we're really excited to have her here to talk about how this project ended up here. Mark, I mentioned Mark Lapacker, is also a director, writer, and producer and artistic director of the Faction. My colleague, Sahar Assaf, is, as many of you know, an actress, a stage director, an assistant professor of theater here at AEB, and the co-director of the Theater Initiative. She most recently translated and directed Garcia Lorca's Blood Wedding, which was done up in Havana last spring. She conceived and directed No Demand, No Supply, a documentary play on sex trafficking in Lebanon, and co-translated and co-directed this King Lear production that I mentioned. The final person I'd like to introduce, I just met her last night, and congratulations for finding our building, is Clare Latham, who's from my hometown, Atlanta, Georgia. We discovered, and I wouldn't necessarily have known it, but she gave a really extraordinary performance. If you have not seen it, I urge you to see it. For those of you who perform, you have some sense of what it's like to be up on stage and be a solo performer for, in a piece this long and poignant. She trained at Stellar Adler Studio. Her London theater includes Doubt, A Parable, which was at the Southwark Playhouse, Danny and the Deep Blue Sea at the Southwark Playhouse, the world premiere of Don't Smoke in Bed, and the UK premiere of Blue Surge at Feneborough. I could, again, go on with what she's done, quite impressive from somebody from Atlanta. And she's worked with Mark and Rachel extensively. So what we're hoping will happen here, and we're going to begin with Rachel, is that Rachel Valentine Smith, that is that one of the things that we're hoping will happen is that we can have a broad-based conversation that will bring you into, that will talk about a whole range of issues, from solo performance to the role of women in the theater, to activism, and obviously issues related to occupied territory, colonial settlerism, all of these sort of topics that came up as a result of the play. So what we're going to do is, I'm hoping that Rachel will talk a little bit about where this came from, where did the project come from, and tell you a little bit about it for those of you who've not seen it yet. And then Sari, as I said, has worked extensively in occupied territories. It's an area of great interest to him. We'll look at it from that perspective. Sahar Assaf, who is herself a performer, has worked as a solo performer, has done a lot on female performance in the female writing and performance in the Mediterranean area, among many other things. And Clare, who is in it, we're going to end up with 4 perspectives on this performance. And we'll open it up after they each speak for about 12 minutes or so for a sort of broader conversation. So if you have questions, there will be a discussion for a good bit afterwards, and that's the whole point. Thanks for your patience. I know it's a long introduction. Rachel, welcome. Welcome to you all.
Thank you, Robert. Maybe I could hire you as my PR person. You seem to be able to sell me better than I can sell myself. Hello everybody. Can I just get a gauge on who's already seen the play? Who's going to see the play tomorrow? Okay, great. And has anybody read the play that might not see it? No? Okay, fine. So I'll just start by giving a brief introduction to the play itself, because it's really part of the journey. So Rachel Corrie was born in Olympia, Washington, USA. I think that it would be a disservice to say an average American sort of upbringing, in that Olympia is known as a very liberal, very artsy part of America. I'm sure that the Americans on the panel can attest to that. Actually, Rachel's early education program was called an options program, which has a focus on arts and also understanding world issues from a young age. So Rachel's extraordinary sort of primary education started in this small town on this lake with the Olympic Mountains as a backdrop, learning about children in Africa who were starving, or learning about other world issues from a really, really young age. And I think that lit, she tells us herself in her diaries that lit a fire in her belly. And I think she had a sense of something global from an extraordinarily young age, and that's something that drove her through her life. So as Rachel grew older and went to college, she stayed in Olympia and went to Evergreen State College, which is, again, has a reputation for being very focused on arts, very liberal. I think Kurt Cobain went there. Did Kurt Cobain go there? There's a couple of sort of famous alumni that sort of you go, of course they went to Evergreen State College. And when she was there, she started finding work in local activism and started engaging in the local community, and also found a group at the college called ISM, the International Solidarity Movement, who are a non-violent group of volunteers who were, especially at the time, working to prevent the demolition of homes in Palestine, in Gaza. And through that work, Rachel then felt compelled to go and be an activist on the front line. Sadly, that resulted in her death 50 days after she arrived. She was killed by a bulldozer, bulldozers that were demolishing the homes, that are still demolishing the homes. She was standing in front of the bulldozer, and the real controversy comes from her death in particular, of whether the bulldozer driver could see her or not. And because of that controversy, and because she's American, that became a huge, a prolific international media case. And what's interesting about that is that because we'd be making a piece of theatre, you tend not to concentrate on the death of the character in the room. So actually we haven't even spoken about anything to do with that moment where her life came to an end, which is quite extraordinary, because that's what brought attention to this young woman, this incredible young woman's life. Rachel was also a prolific writer. She journaled a lot, and she kept in communication with the people at home a lot when she was in Palestine. So because her death had this huge media attention to it, the Guardian newspaper in the UK, with the permission of her parents, published some of her emails that were from Gaza that was sent home. And then from that, the late amazing actor Alan Rickman approached Elise Dodgson at the Royal Court Theatre. She's the international producer there. She works a lot in the Middle East. And they decided that this story needed to be shared on a wider platform. So along with Catherine Viner, who is now editor-in-chief at the Guardian newspaper, at the time she was a journalist that had worked a lot in the Middle East and was working for the Guardian, they edited Rachel's journals and emails. When they approached the text, they knew they wanted to work with Megan Dobbs, who was the original performer of My Name is Rachel Corrie. But they actually spent 18 months trying different things with the material, writing new material, thinking about getting different perspectives in the play. And then after this sort of 18-month process, they realised that the thing that really mattered were Rachel's words, and it became this solo show that Megan performed at the Royal Court Theatre in 2005. The success of that show then led to a West End transfer. The West End transfer then got a New York transfer to the New York Theatre Workshop. That show never happened because the artistic director backed down because of pressure from the Jewish community, suggesting that the play was anti-Semitic. The play then did happen in New York at the Minetta Lane, that's right, the Minetta Lane Theatre, and I think that was a great success, and since which the play's been performed all over the world. I think it's a real testament to Rachel's parents that they have taken this unbearable tragedy from their lives and allowed us to explore it as a piece of theatre and offer something that can have a real sociological impact. It can start a conversation, and it can make us Westerners a little bit more aware of certain things that go on in the world. So I'm very grateful to them that they allowed this to happen, and I'm very grateful to the whole team that's managed to make this production happen. It was a play I was aware of. I never saw the original production, but it was a play I was aware of, and it was, as a director, it was one of those plays in my pile of plays I must do. And then there was something last year in terms of where my work was going personally as an artist, and having come to Lebanon and co-directed King Lear with Sahar, I knew that I wanted to focus on something that had more of an international angle. And so I said to Mark, I think this is the play I want to do next. I'd mentioned it to Clare. At the same time, we were having conversations, and we're still having conversations with the British Council here about work we can do in Lebanon, because King Lear was such a fantastic experience for us. There's a lot of work that sort of gets labelled as cultural exchange, but the exchange that we had on this project was so rich and so reaffirming in terms of what theatre can do and what theatre can be, that we were really keen to continue our collaborations here. So then Cindy Metzler at the British Council said that she really wanted to be part, or she wanted the British Council to be a part of this inaugural European Theatre Festival here in Beirut. Did we have anything on the table? So we offered her a Shakespeare, and we said, we're also developing My Name is Rachel Corrie. She took both to the European Union table, and the whole EU organisation said it has to be My Name is Rachel Corrie. This play is really important. It'll have a really big impact on the audiences. And what's amazing, and also the reason why it's so important to the British Council is because we've stupidly voted for Brexit. And so Cindy and the British Council are having to prove to the rest of the European Union that we have a place in that conversation as British people, British artists. So this extraordinary convolution of sort of global events has led to us as a predominantly British company working with an American actress coming to Beirut and performing a show that is about this extraordinary woman's journey from America to the Middle East. So it's been an incredible experience, and I really hope that those that have seen it and those that do see it can really gain something from the experience.
Well, we'll continue to have this conversation, and as I said, join in. I'm really glad that Rachel mentioned that, two of our partners here are the British Council, and as I mentioned, Sahar is the co-director of the theatre initiative. So we're working with a number of departments and programs here, among them media studies and women and gender studies. This particular one, interestingly, we're the Center of American Studies, and we're working with the British Council, which is really quite wonderful to do a play, again, about an American with an actress from the US in Lebanon. So this is our international mission made manifest. Sari, Hanafi?
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert. When Robert suggested me to talk, I was a little bit hesitant, but because I met Rachel in Beit Sahur when she was trained to be a non-violent activist in 2003. So I follow, of course, closely the debate at that time. I adventured to talk, and you will see I have more relation than this to all this story. But I am a sociologist, and I don't want to adventure to make any film or play critique in front of Robert, Koros, Zena, Greg, my colleagues in media studies. They do nothing but this. So in social science we provide a boring analysis usually, okay? And this is why we do some graphs, colorful graphs, to compensate our boring things, not to be bored. But I think I would like to stick to some view as sociologists and participant observation on the question of Palestine and to deliver some thought. First, let me say what I love in the play, that almost half of it is not related to Palestine. Is telling us how we come to be interested in Palestine. It's everything but what the media often portray who are the supporter of Palestinian cause, and channel it through fanatism, eccentricism, sometimes anarchism, in a sense of not in a political sense of anarchism, which is very important, but in a social meaning. We see a trajectory, intellectual trajectory of Rachel, how she comes from her presentation in grade 5th in the school. We see her body language beyond the text, how she is. She has this humanistic view. How she will how she see the globalization as something to redress what is going on, or this neoliberal globalizations, and the responsibility, the ethical responsibility of the individuals, that we can do something. And I think this is why, if historically the position vis-à-vis Franco was a gauge of being human, or having this humanistic ethos in the 50s, I would say Palestine is really the gauge, since specifically the mid 60s until today. Okay, it's a gauge of what the meaning of questioning the neoliberal order, what the meaning of being in late capitalism, on this savage world about colonialism, but also I'm very connected this about the vision of what society we wanted. I would extrapolate a little bit. I would consider today the position vis-à-vis Syria, and not necessarily, I mean, to be with the opposition or against the opposition, but there is a human rights issues in Syria. I mean, it's also a gauge of humanity, a gauge of what the meaning of the universality of the human rights, and unfortunately we see that some of the leftists worldwide and in the region, that they succeed in the test of the gauge of being supporter of Palestinian cause, but have so much trouble to understand what the meaning of protracted regime who use the torture in a systematic way, in a way of dealing of any subjectivity, political subjectivity. So bravo for this play. Really, we saw that this anarchic personality of Rachel, in fact, is so systematic of bringing a vision of the world, and how she reached to come to Palestine, and specifically to Gaza. And I will tell you something, that actually Gaza is not often a popular place for the ISM, International Solidarity Movement. This is if you like, you have an umbrella organization, and the branch chapter is in Beit Zahur. They deal with international activists. Not all international activists. They have a niche, Anglo-Saxon niche, if you like. There is a French niche, an Italian niche, go not through this organization. But what I will try to say that really West Bank, the holy place of Jerusalem, I mean, make many activists would like to stay in West Bank rather than in Gaza. So it's already an extra gauge, an extra sense of responsibility of Rachel that she went there. So I have 2 points about the play, and then I will say something about what the meaning of being a member of ISM or this kind of activism. So the second point is it's very interesting that all these conversations with her parents. Okay, so we see Rachel, I mean, negotiate with and I like all this. I mean, I was surprised. It's harsh criticism to her father. I mean, and we see it in the play how her father. I mean, a kind of someone like working in financial market. I mean, how he see the world very different from her, and how she will explain to him that suicide bomber Palestinian are also bring. It's a part of the cycle. I mean, you cannot isolate it and as an episode, a terrorist episode in this Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So, but what? So we are lucky to have all this diary and email exchange. But it reminds me my exchange with my parents, because I came to Lebanon. It was my second time. During the Israeli invasion in 1982. So I was, in that time, a student in Damascus University doing civil engineering, nothing to do with sociology. You see, more boring than sociology. Okay, so I came and I have a long conversation and 24 hours of negotiation with my parents in the refugee camps. I grew up in Yarmouk camp in Damascus, to convince them why I should go and leave. And it was in the time, I just remind you, it was the exam time for Damascus University. So I lost one semester to go and stay 2 months during the invasion. So it was almost the same conversation, not about why Palestine, but is a kind to say why you? I mean, those who fight they are not intelligent like you. I mean, going to civil engineering. Look, I mean, my dad told me, look to Fidaiyin, look, because they have nothing to say, to do, they become Fidai, something very nasty. And I am sure he is saying this, it's not because he is convinced, but he tried to use all the different arguments to prohibit their son to go to Lebanon. So really, I found so genuine this kind of exchange, and you can find it in different contexts. So now I would like to move to my third and last point, to disclose for the first time in my life that I did a survey about ISM, okay? And against all what I see some of my students who took my class on graduate research method, where I say, no censorship, you would never, I mean, you have ethics of responsibility, how you deliver your data, but you don't censor your data, okay? So against this overarching principle, if you like, yes, I did almost 72 interviews with the member of Solidarity Movement activists, French, Italian, British, American, mainly in this four. And I was very curious to know why. I mean, mainly about their their motivations, why they are interested in Palestine. And actually I refused to, I didn't publish it because in that time I realized I'm talking of feeling social injustice and the global injustice, this humanistic ethos, or ethics of a humanity. I mean, to have this is very strong, and we find it among many, I would say, leftist group that they have politically in the left, where you find them coming to Palestinian issues. And the second big motivation is quite religious. So especially among Italian and some British. I mean, if you like to kind of theology of liberation, many of them Jesuit from the Italian side. So it's a very interesting. So you feel that it's not about the place of Jerusalem. Huh? Let's put it clear. It's not like it's not a kind of that we have responsibility vis-a-vis Jerusalem. Not at all. But I mean, it's clear they come through a kind of a Jesuit education. And not necessarily Jesuit. I mean, I found also Dominicans, etc. But they come from orders, and they really from there they were sensitized politically to the question of Palestine. So this is where I see why I insisted in the question of motivation. Actually, I did it after a tour. I did it in France. Talking about Palestinian, about the second Intifada. So I was touring in many places in France, and in many places it was a criticism of a mythical figure in France called José Bové. José Bové is a leftist guy who smashed the front of McDonald's in Champs-Élysées, really is a very symbolic McDonald's. So and he had a trial, and he went to the prison for that. So just to show you that it was a big story, how you localize some kind of multinational neoliberal actors, sovereign-free actors like McDonald's. So it was a lot of criticism of José, and when I mentioned José Bové, who was, I forgot to say what this is, he is a head of one of the union, peasant union in France. So it was say, this for celebrity. He went, hero. He wanted to show that he is a hero. He went to Palestine, and he, in front of the camera, he take a picture, etc. So so I did this survey, and I will end here. I used to give this, what I witnessed in my eyes, what happened to José Bové when he was in Palestine. So actually, when I was in Palestine, I have French passport, so I don't have a Palestinian ID. Otherwise, I cannot travel. By the way, this is, you should know my positioning. I have a French passport, so I was called by Mustafa Barghouti, all the leaders to accompany many of this ISME group, because I have this French passport, and even in that time I have an Egyptian car, Malak al-Qahira. So I was called in Ramallah al-Masri. I am not Egyptian, but just because I have this car, because I have my position as a researcher in the French Research Center in Cairo. I'm coming with my car. So in any case, this is another story. So I was accompanying my the group of French ISM people and Jose Bové. So we entered to a village, and he saw, I'm very moved, I say. He saw a destroyed olives, and he sat under a tree, and he started crying for a half an hour. Nobody can really stop him crying. He is so affected. He felt the savage of Israelis. I mean, uprooted. Because he is a peasant. He knows what the meaning cultivating an olive tree. Okay, olive tree is not something you put it. It's not apple or etc. No, it needs So I was conveying this image that this guy is not looking for celebrity, and many of them. I know Rachel lost her life, but I mean many of them they lost something. There is almost the statistics during the Intifada. If my memory is good, in 2005 when I left Palestine, almost 17 persons from ISM lost something, a hand injured. I mean, it was some heavy injury. So it's really. I mean, we should. This is why, and I will stop here. I cannot tell you. I mean, people here when I came here, so I take every year my student to Shatila camp, and always I have some yuppie Lebanese or etc. say, going to Shatila, going to Burj Barajni, etc. So I always telling them, they never ever touch. I challenge you, if anyone give me one example of a harm arrived to a non-Palestinian in a refugee camp, and specific any or international, because for the Palestinian is the ultimatum, the utmost sense of really of solidarity is to come to visit them while they are in their plight. I stop here.
Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful, and I can't imagine anything better for performers and for people who are artists and theater makers than to have this kind of insight. The next speaker, Sahar Assaf, also one of the many things that she does in her work is weaving together the social and political with the theatrical. Before I met her, she made a documentary film on female fighters during the Lebanese Civil War. Her most recent theatrical work, which I mentioned, is on sex trafficking here in Lebanon. She did a play about workers here at AB, and what she quickly discovered, along with the students and others who worked on it, was the invisibility of the people that create the infrastructure that allow for people's education. People simply took it for granted or didn't notice the people who make it possible. So this is woven into her work too, and one aspect of her work. So Sahar, please.
Thank you. Just to attest to Sari's last point, I worked for a year in Ain Helwi camp, and I have to say I never felt safer. Yeah. Robert asked me to talk briefly about the limitations of documentary theater, since the play in discussion today is a documentary play, and I thought that's a nice opportunity because I personally am not only an advocate of this form of theater, but and a fan of this form of theater, but I'm heavily involved in a documentary play at the moment, and I thought that's actually a very nice opportunity to be to do some kind of self-evaluation and reflect on the kind of work I'm doing as I'm doing it, because sometimes a year later a reflection helps in a way but doesn't help in a way. So, and my first thought was, and I jotted down some thoughts that I'd love to share, maybe they'll give us a new insight into the discussion and questions for Rachel and Claire. And my first thought was, watching the play yesterday in Beirut, and this is the first time this play, has been produced here, to my knowledge. And for me, it's a very touchy play. Like, I was moved. I read the play 2 years back, and I was moved, and I was moved yesterday. But at the same time, I know the story, and I don't need to be convinced, and I don't need, I'm very compassionate to the story of Rachel, and I see all the details. And this is one challenge, I think, of documentary theater, and I guess it also applies to other forms of theater, not only documentary, but maybe documentary, I say, because documentary theater usually have an agenda. So it's not art for art's sake, I would say. And that is, the kind of people that come see this kind of theater are usually not the people that we are targeting, not the people we would like, the people who avoid the documentary piece that we're working on are usually the people that we would like to see. So that's a kind of dilemma, and I remember reading some of the scholarship, because I gave this play to my students in 2006 while we were working on another verbatim or documentary play. I'm very now careful about using the word verbatim, but documentary about the experience of janitors at AUB, and we used My Name is Rachel Corrie as an example of documentary theater. And I was reading that there was many demonstrations happening outside the law court, Jewish communities, and not going in before even seeing the play, before watching the play. They were just demonstrating the play and the story of Rachel Corrie. So that's one thought that occurred to me. Another thought is, the authenticity of documentary theater, because essentially we're working with true factual material or true material. Most, there's a spectrum of what counts as documentary theater. It's a big umbrella term. But in general, we use documents, we use reports, we use interviews with people. But at the end of the day, we're collecting these material, and then the process of editing, that mediation that we do as theater makers to put these stories on stage, maybe gets lost in the process of watching the performance. When we watch, for instance, reality TV, we're usually aware of the camera, we're usually aware of the staging of the play, but when we watch documentary theater, and I think that's why for some people it's very dangerous and it's censored, the audience would take the story as real because we lose track of that process of mediation. And at the same time, I think of documentary theater as a process rather than a product. So it's the process itself is what we can call verbatim, but the end product is not verbatim because it's it's a nice challenge actually, because it's very subjective in a way. And I love here the definition that David Herr, a playwright, British playwright, says about documentary theater. He says it does what journalism fails to do. In a sense, it's a nice idea, because yes, it's true, it's not objective, but I guess that's the aim. It is subjective. When I'm collecting these stories and then I'm trying to arrange them, I'm telling a story of real people, but it also becomes partly my story now. Now, in the case of Rachel Corrie, I think it's also very peculiar, because usually when you're working in such a form, you're working with real people who are still alive. You've interviewed them or you've read the stories, and there's a chance for them to be involved in that process and to comment on it and even to change. When I did my work on sex trafficking, I would send the selected excerpts of the interviews back to the women I interviewed and to the journalists that I interviewed, and they would say, yes, okay, you can proceed, or maybe like add something or remove. So they're part of forming that content. But in the case of this play, I think it's very interesting also this idea that we're we're using the diaries, these are private material, and we're using the emails, again, private material of a person who is not with us anymore. So that distance, I mean, that's just a question. I'm just throwing up questions out there, I guess. I don't have answers.
You did have an answer, if you let us know.
Yeah. Now, I think, although I'm speaking here of limitations, but I couldn't but, think of also advantages of documentary theater. And one of them is that documentary theater tells us relevant stories. And not to say that fiction kind of theater doesn't tell us relevant stories, but, but sometimes what is pronounced in the interviews or the diary in this case, or, the documents that we use in documentary theater is even more, would be more articulate, more pronounced than anything we could write. And we saw this yesterday in Rachel Corrie, in the text itself. In addition, I think the advantage of using theater is that it really makes home for stories like Rachel Corrie, a story that, media in the UK would not be interested in, not in the UK, in the West in general. This is not a story that would, make headlines. It made headlines because of the play and the controversy around the play. And at the same time, it gives us an answer to the question of the why. That's why I think it's superior to journalism, because, and as you said, Sari, like the first half or more of the play is not about Palestine. And this is very interesting because this is the part of the story that gets lost in the media. We don't see it. We see the story of this American woman that confronted a bulldozer, and of course all the story there about whether he saw her or not, but we don't know about the motivations that are very, they're not necessarily exclusive to an American woman. These are things that we, as people involved in politics or concerned about the communities we live in and reflective about these communities, we would think about. You feel connected to that woman despite the fact that there's oceans separating us. So the why question gets completely lost in the media, especially today, the mainstream media. Whereas and that's why I think this is such an important work and needed and necessary work. I go back to the limitation and I say probably a nice problem in documentary theater is that we're trying to give voice to people, but at the same time we're censoring. And that's maybe that's a challenge, just, to be aware of. So what, the fact that it has an opinion and has an agenda makes it art. It's not, but at the same time it's, subjective. And the last thing I would say, I'm just gonna keep it short, is that the play, Rachel Corrie, is an example of a theater that, opens a conversation with the people. Usually this is one of also the advantages and the aims of documentary theater. It's not only the play, it's what happens after the play. So it's the process that leads to that product, but then what comes after it is very important. So I would like to, on this note, thank Rachel and Clare for bringing this project here, and Mark and Robert for putting us all together here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's one of a number of things that I hope Claire will talk about whatever you'd like, is that the fact that this is constructed almost like a Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age story, I would argue is what makes it so dangerous and powerful, is that, in fact, you can no longer walk out of the theater and think, oh, this young woman's misguided, she's foolish, or she's a monster, right? And that becomes deeply problematic, though I completely agree that there were a lot of protesters who weren't interested, who already knew in advance, and whatever. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I think it's particularly interesting for performer is that you actually go through quite a substantial change, which every actor or performer, I think, you have a trajectory, and that 1 hour and 45 minutes or whatever every time you go out and do it. So please talk about that or anything else you'd like, and we're so happy to have you here.
Sure. I mean,
Do you want to talk a little bit about what it's like?
it's a little bit terrifying. It was a little. I don't really think about like, do I get nervous about getting all the lines in my head, or the breadth of the material. But this time I was like, woof, this is a lot, and it's a lot to do. And just touching back on the where she comes from, leading to where she ends up, is interesting, because going through the first little bit over a third, almost half the play, she's in Olympia still. You follow her from she reads a journal from when she was 12. She experiences breakup. She experiences fighting with her parents, loving her parents, finding a love of where she comes from. And then all of a sudden it's like, now I'm in Jerusalem. And I was like, wait a second, like where did that come from? I mean, the way the play sets it up, and the way that the journals, the huge scope of journals that have been compiled, you see this slow burn of this realization, this fire in her belly that something's not right, something has to change. And that there comes a point for her where that it bursts into the present, that bursts into the immediate and the need and the demand to do something that she saw was wrong, and that if she didn't do that, if she didn't go directly to Palestine to help these people who she saw at the utmost of suffering and injustice, then she is in fact a part of the problem, which is a voicelessness, certainly on the Western side of things, due to a huge editing of what we receive in the media and humanitarian groups being selective. But and as Sahar was saying, it's very daunting, I think I would say, to look at this huge scope of work, these journals. And there's a book of her whole collected writing, scribbles from childhood all the way through right before, like probably the day, or maybe the day before the day that she was killed. And she's not around, and it's not something that you want to contact her family about and say, tell me all about what she was like when she was 10. That's not really appropriate, and it's not really applicable. So you just have to, and also someone's journals are so private. I mean, I'm not going to show my diary to somebody, let alone present it to strangers, hundreds of strangers. That's bananas. So it's looking into the personality of someone, the soul of someone that they keep to themselves, which is private and vulnerable, and then figuring out how to turn that into a person that you meld with for an hour and 45 minutes, and doing justice to that person. I have to say, I felt a lot of responsibility to Rachel. She's here. She's a part of this process. These are her, not only do her words live on, but I do feel a certain presence from her work and taking on her words, and I felt a gigantic responsibility to still do. I'm still doing it. To be truthful to her, and to be truthful to what drove her and what her passions were. They're so important, and that is why this play exists, I think, is because those things need to be heard, and those things need to be felt, those things need to be done by other people, not necessarily stand in front of tanks. We can't all stand in front of tanks. Maybe we shouldn't stand in front of tanks, but we should do something. We should be active. The ISM's big philosophy was direct action, and not violence, of course, but I think direct action, doing something, being an active person, was this thing that built for her, which is really inspiring to take on. I mean, I feel I feel not worthy, I guess, is one way to put it, of inhabiting her shoes. I think they're rather big shoes to fill.
But you do it with the club.
Sure.
You do.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, one thing that we'll open the floor here in a second, but one thing that, occurs to me that's sort of gone across everybody's comments is this idea of activism, because one of the comments I heard after the play was, well, it's the world we know, and it may have gone all over the world, though I imagine there are some places it's not been produced. And it's interesting to try to think about what those might be. And oh, well, it's a world I already know about. And she sort of can be viewed, and this is me extrapolating, no one said this, is that she's sort of a kind of Western do-gooder or whatever. What we've seen, though, I think in the discourse here is that she's an activist. The echoes of whether it's the French agricultural movement, liberation theology, civil rights movement. I, like Clare, grew up in Atlanta, but at a much earlier point in which the civil rights movement depended upon people who are about 20 years old not listening to their parents, right? Their parents told them, don't do this. Well, in other words, if everyone is going to refuse to sacrifice, then you will not have change. You will not have a movement. And in fact, she represents something very akin to this. You see it in liberation theology, priests who are willing to go out and work with peasants, and they die, and they know they may die, right? And she obviously knew that she might die. So in that sense, it's understanding, I think, something that Sari was alluding to, which is what is the motivation for people to engage in this kind of activism. And I think that's a very interesting question. If you look through it through that prism here, as opposed to, oh yes, we've had a lot of trauma, we've had wars, we've had upheavals, we understand it. I don't know how many people have gone to Gaza here. Could I see a hands? This is Sadi's point. He's been to Gaza, right? You're seeing a really extreme version of something that, you're putting your body on the line. And in all of these other instances I'm talking about, you personally are unlikely to benefit from this. And so you would ask, well, why would you do that? Christian ethic? What would drive a humanism that's, whatever. This is why she becomes a very interesting character. She's not likely to benefit from this. She doesn't know she's going to die, right? But the pathos of her story comes from the fact that, of course, she does. She knows she might, and she does. So that's the activism, it seems to me, is one of the sort of key threads. Where does an activist come from? Where does a Gramscian intellectual come from? What makes people, besides being an armchair sort of passive observer of what's going on, to going, I'm actively going to get involved, and I may not benefit, but my family will, my community will, my children will, right? And I'm willing to do that, right? That's a very interesting character in my opinion, and it's a kind of a world historical figure in that sense.
We were talking to a Palestinian artist who's now living in London called Momin Swatat, who he's an actor and a writer, and he grew up in the West Bank, but he was saying that the thing he's understood, the thing that connects all of the people that he's met from outside of Palestine, people that have come through the ISM or other organisations, isn't necessarily just a sense of wanting to do good, but it's a sense of culpability, the actual responsibility, the sense that our tax money is funding this, in inverted commas, conflict. So I found that really useful, because I think that connects to some, in terms of the play, that connects to directly to some of the things Rachel talks about. But also Kath Biner, when I spoke to her just before we came out, one of the editors of the text, she said, she asked me if I'd been to Palestine, and I said no, and she said to go to Palestine is to understand Rachel. And I think that's really important in terms of once you're there, and Rachel says it herself, nothing can prepare you for knowing what it is like until you are there. And I think that's really important to not judge people that are there when you, like you say, you know.
And is there a moment, Claire, in the play in which that kind of recognition, I actually, again, thought what Sari said was incredibly insightful. In other words, that it becomes a litmus test, or whatever it is you want to, he used another term, of a kind of progressive sensibility in the last 75 years. It's like, what do you think about this? Much like the Spanish Civil War was in the 1930s. Is there a moment where she realizes, like, you know, British citizens who went to fight against Franco realized, I have to go. This is my fight too. This is my battle.
Yeah, I say that comes pretty early on in the play, actually. She has a lot of connections of anti-war global justice activism based in Olympia, and of course contact with the sort of ISM folks who were based there or had come back, or were from the school and then came back as well. And that seems to be sort of it. So we have this sort of like pre-Palestine section of the play, which is just like Rachel as a girl, Rachel finding her way, and then all of a sudden it shifted, and there's a decision that has been made off camera, as it were, that she just knew she had to go. And in that very section, that very bit where it sort of shifts, she says, I need to go to a place and meet the people who are at the other end of the tax money that goes to fund the US military. And that's really interesting because it's the Israeli military. But if you trace the bulldozers back, and you trace the guns back, they are not from Israel. They are from other militaries in other countries. A lot of stuff from the United States funds its way there. So, and what funds the US military is US tax money. So she understood this sort of chain reaction of what happens when you pay tax money and you don't have a choice, and it kind of just goes where the government wants it to go. We might have a border wall. Cool, I don't want to pay for that, you know what I mean? And I think Rachel understood that deeply and fundamentally, even on a sort of commercial, capitalistic level. Before she went, and then I think once she got there, she, as Rachel was saying, was sort of overwhelmed by how true that was.
Well, it's fascinating. This border wall question is fascinating. A lot of Americans, I say this as one, they're able to get it when it's with Mexico. Oh, that's terrible, for whatever reason, they don't seem to be able to make the next step. Okay, so the next step is whatever. It's sort of like, well, it's us. I have a direct stake in this, right? Please, we'd love to open it up. Where, obviously, there are a whole range of things we could talk about. I think what Sahar raised about documentary theater is fascinating. I think, where does Palestine stand in this moment of the rise of the right wing? That Sari mentioned. Now we're watching one after another government become extreme right wing, and we're seeing Palestine more and more marginalized.
Mini Trumps.
Many Trumps.
He's interested in the Trumps. I'm interested in mini Trumps.
Yeah. Many or mini?
Yeah. This is what I was saying.
Yeah.
Mini Trumps.
Both, unfortunately. There's a Brazilian election on Sunday. So, are there questions? We'd love to have questions. Yes, Omar. Hi. Please just come up here and say your question into the camera, okay?
Because, as a Palestinian and as a person who really believes that the arts can spread and improve the situation, I feel like it's important to bring it here to the Arab region as well, because, it's important for the West to see it, but as Arabs, there's a lot of us, including me, who didn't know a lot about the situation and a lot about how things are. But my question is, the issue that revolves around, there's an essence of fear and hope, and the words that in the play itself reflect that, but I feel, you know, as a director and actor, you need to kind of push it, or like I'm trying to ask, what are the touch points that you focused on to kind of bring that essence out, and like you said, once you're there, it's completely different. Like you really don't know how it is when you're there. So how are you able to show that to a countless number of audiences, you know, here and in the West?
Sure. I'll start and then you can probably say something much more interesting. I think that it's fair to say that we both found the process challenging. It's unusual to have a text that hasn't been written for performance, which is something you've alluded to and connects to some of the things Sahar is saying. And at some point, I think we realised we needed to be brave enough to make friends with Rachel and acknowledge her presence, but also really focus on our job as theatre makers and try and pull out as much of our usual process as we could so that we could end up with a piece of theatre. And it's a real challenge because, of course, the most important thing to us is being sensitive to the fact that this is a real story from a real human, and there's a lot of responsibility with that. So it got to the point at which we really sort of knuckled down and focused on what we could do in terms of bringing a logic to the way that the play is united through the different diary entries or different sort of pieces of writing as it's been edited together. And also using some of our usual techniques, sense memory exercises, that sort of thing, to try and identify what's going on with the character at that point.
Yeah, I mean, well, I haven't been in Palestine. I have never witnessed anything like that in my life. I, see things, I can see images, but I can't really understand it. I just, I physically cannot do it. But what I can do is sort of use my technique, which is to create real memories, create real images for myself that Rachel would have seen. Watching children be harmed. And that is so fundamentally wrong, so fundamentally scary to be an adult that can't protect a child. And that is sort of a universal feeling, that fear, that disgust, that sense of wanting to fix it, however, like, illogically that doesn't, but so that is those kinds of things that I can tap into, and as an actor, I can share the iota of that feeling, and then just follow Rachel's passion. She's so articulate that I just sort of go where she takes me in that sense. But it is a challenge for sure. I don't know how it would be different if I hadn't been to Palestine. It's impossible to say. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying too, is that a lot of people don't approach the play as, it's the story of a writer, right? I mean, she obviously saw herself as a writer, an artist, a reporter, and the idea that this was just kind of like, she was writing to write. I think she, as most writers do, was kind of writing herself into history too, right? Because she understood that her story, she was making up that story. What's very beautiful though, and this is an interesting part, it seems, is there are many theatrical forms that you could put on any life, but one that clearly you did not opt for, and I think would be very damaging, is a martyrology, is that somehow she's a martyr. She's not a martyr. It's not, I think that's what I came away from the play thinking, this is a kind of somebody who got wisdom, is somebody who, what does it take in this life to achieve wisdom? And the irony, of course, is when you get wisdom, then, frequently it's at a point in your life where you really can't do that much about it in this case because, of course, she dies. But it's a very important point, I think, that has to do with what Sahar is saying is a documentary play. I think a lot of people mistake it for nonfiction or the truth. It's another form. Michael Moore has a new documentary film, and people think it's the truth. I'm sure he's got a big group of people go, oh, that's the truth. Well, it's a documentary form, and I think theater functions like that too. And its power may have been what people found so threatening, is they must have thought something about this form was extremely threatening. Otherwise, you wouldn't have seen it censored and resisted in so many places. Other questions? Saren, please, just Firas, can you try to get Saren on camera here?
Of course.
I'm sorry? Yeah, Mark.
Remark.
Oh, Ramar.
Which marks
Marcane. Yes.
This is about really an interesting comment that you made in relation to martyrdom, because actually in Arab American writing, for some of these poets, she was represented as basically someone who was wrapped in the flag of Palestine without any washing, any of the rituals that usually, non-martyrs would have to go through before they're being buried.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there was a transformation, there was a reappropriation of this figure and somehow a rewriting of her story.
Right.
Now, the question is really associated with this dilemma of the representation of violence in art. So, and my question is actually related to the choice of scenes to represent her story. Are there any specific moments that you felt were either beyond representation or would be diminished by representation, that you had to just allude to them without really putting them up front there, out there?
I think a lot of that work has been done in the editing of the journals, because like Claire said, that her full writings have been published. And I made a resolution for myself where I had to trust that Alan and Catherine and Megan made the right choices for their process. There have been criticisms about some of the editorialising from the entries, but as you've said, documentary theatre, and as you've said, is still subjective, and we have the material we have. So I think that also the fact that Rachel's writing changes from when she's in Olympia towards the end of the play is useful, and those entries that are short and full of information and reports allows us as theatre makers to go, that's all she could write about in that moment, all she could offer was the facts. So then we can build an emotional psychology behind that, and then that's where the audience become active in terms of engaging their imagination as to what's going on, and I think that's really important in solo performance. The audience have to be really active. So I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Does that? Yeah, please.
No, can I say what I love on this play, that it's not sensational. It's not really put you in a way that you can but cry, but not think. I mean, crying here, it's sometimes it's again thinking. It's or you will be overwhelmed by something that that really moves you so much, but I mean at the expense of thinking. But here the force of the play, that in fact we keep let us think about many things, and we see the sense of injustice. I think how she described the food of the Palestinians, and how the play and how they spend their time watching so powerful to tell about what the meaning of being stranded in such a situation. And yeah, so it's so powerful without really, overwhelm you emotionally. And I saw many theater and movies about Palestine where really it's, I don't feel well, really. I think, especially when I see from the vantage point of this region where the violence is everywhere, art should really maybe showing us less violence. We don't want social realism. It's every yeah. So I think there is a responsibility here for the art to emancipate us from vulgar reality.
Well, if I understood Sarin's remark correctly, sorry about that, Mark. One of the questions inherent, or issues inherent in it, is one of representation that we're seeing repeatedly come up, like whose story gets told. So in other words, the civil rights movement, when you have a film like Mississippi Burning that's about white FBI agents as opposed to black civil rights activists, why is it being told from that perspective, or why is the suffering of some able to elicit a kind of general feeling, whereas the individual suffering of Palestinians every day is not? And I think that's one kind of final turn of the kind of consciousness that Rachel goes through. Is it's one thing to be able to imagine, it's another thing, and I think we're seeing this turn where people are telling their own stories, as it were. I think what Sari's saying in terms of what works in theater is seeing yourself in other people regardless of whether or not they belong to your ostensible group and it's a sort of humanistic question. Is there a general humanism? I think Clare alludes to it when she's talking about children. It's also a sort of Stella Adler technique, pardon me if I'm simplifying it, but it very much is. It's seeing that story in your story. And theater is one of the media that does this best. That's my story, whether the person belongs to your gender or ethnicity or sexuality or whatever, that's my story. That does not obviate this question of representation, though, and it's a huge and important question of whose voices get heard, what gets disseminated. But again, this was one that was suppressed too. This was not like people were like, oh, this is great, let's tell this story. This was a story that was very, very actively suppressed, right? People didn't want this story, certainly in the United States, and I know this firsthand from my own whatever. They're against it, it's trouble. And then you have to ask why that is. And it looks a lot like the freedom riders who went to the American South, yes, they were basically, whites from the North who went and participated in the freedom rides in the South or whatever, but that is as dangerous as anything else, right? It's not that their suffering matters more, it's that once you get solidarity of that kind, that becomes this political force very frightening to people.
On our first evening here, we were just off Hamley Street, and there was an older gentleman having a cup of tea outside, and we got chatting. And within 3 minutes, we decided to solve all the world issues. But he said to me, the day that we stop operating with money, the day we'll see peace in the world. So,
The way, sorry, again?
the day we stop operating with money is the day we'll see peace in the world. So.
Well, it's interesting she links it to capitalism and to neoliberalism, and it's very interesting when you have these questions of whether it's identity or other sorts of political questions, what is generally absent are questions of class, social class, capitalism, the economic system. Usually, sometimes they happen hand in hand. But it's fascinating how it's almost from the beginning that her getting of wisdom is her recognition at a very early age of a kind of class privilege that she has. I find that quite fascinating. Other comments, questions before we go? We're so happy to see all of you. Yes, Vanessa, please.
So yeah, with this link which came up in Sari's comments as well between Rachel's story and neoliberalism and late capitalism, I'm curious about this notion that has come up a couple of times that you can't know until you go, right? That will be something fundamentally transformative or different, and especially when you bring up watching a child be harmed. We see children on the streets every day in Beirut, and it's been one of the hardest things for me to see in my daily life as I've adapted to being here. And we have this film that's come out, Home by Nadine Levikin recently, which really is this close-up view on these really harsh conditions. And so I'm just curious if I think it's a debatable point whether you need to go in order to see whether there's something there. It could be a litmus test, and that it's for humanism and progressivism, your position on Palestine at this moment. But what Palestine is, the way in which the people of Palestine are totally mistreated, and the extent of the injustice against them is not something that's absent from so many other spaces throughout the world. So I'm just wondering if we could discuss that question a little bit more, because I think when it comes to direct action, to think that to go there is the place of direct action is another way to keep on not doing anything about the children that we see in Lebanon, about the issues that we have in all these other places, which could still represent, doing what your parents don't want you to do, but in a lot of different spots.
Can I say that we should analyze. There is a difference between taking, for instance, what I do, taking my class every year to a camp where I feel when we discuss it in the following session, that it's a little, for many of them, this visit is transformative. I mean, we didn't realize. I mean, we live here. But I am from Rayim, next to Shatila. I mean, no way. I mean, it's just 5 minutes and all this misery there. I mean, so you have this function of this. But I would argue that ISM as a concept is really, I see it like freedom fighters. I see it like now the so-called foreign fighters. Now it become like a curse. If you say foreign fighters, you think about ISIS. By the way, those who went to Ukraine to fight either for for Ukrainian or pro-Russian, it's also multi-thousands. We curse. Every time we think about foreign fighters, we think about ISIS and etc. But I mean, it's ultimate sense of altruism and go to action. And I will tell you, the Palestinians, they would have never been able in the years of the Intifada, and I would say until today in many areas, to harvest their olives, their plant without the presence of this from. They are a very important witness. I mean, so they are very instrumental. So so it's not only, we should not see with this act of ISM, specifically this ISM, just as to know better the Palestinian cause or sensibilize better about this injustice, political injustice and colonialism. but more than that.
Well, any final comment? I'd also like just Rachel and Claire to let you know about the place tonight at Masra Madina, again at 8:30 for those of you who didn't see it. Sure, we'll get one more question from Greg. And then on Saturday, it's
Zukak at 5 p.m.
Zukak at 5 p.m. on Saturday at 5. Okay, right. Okay, so Greg,
Yeah, an extremely simple question. Well, extremely straightforward question. Is it a conscious decision on your part not to go to Palestine?
No, it's just a practical one. We have been talking about this show for a couple of months, and I've been doing other work as well. It's just not something that I could do before doing this show.
It was definitely practical considerations, and then I worry about, I think the easiest way for us to get there is through Tel Aviv, and I don't want that to prohibit me from coming to Lebanon. So, yeah.
But believe me, you can make a big case even to show it in Tel Aviv. And I'm sure you have some radical civil society actors are ready to fight for you to present it there. And I would say, really, this is the most important two places to present inside of Israel and in West Bank and Gaza. I mean, so I encourage you strongly, really.
There has been a performance in the West Bank.
I think an Iraqi actress performed it.
Yeah. And it was in Arabic, with the translation that was used last night.
Yeah.
But
By the way, the translation is need a lot of work. Sorry to say, but with a very awkward translation. I mean, I was looking from time to time just
Not
to.
theatrical, but it gives the meaning, I guess.
Yeah, but when you translate interesting by Muthir in Arabic, I mean,
What do you translate interesting as? Actually, had this conversation a lot.
no, it depends on context, but I mean, مثير جدا.
مثير للاهتمام.
مثير للاهتمام. مثير has a very sexual connotation.
My Arabic stretches to about 12 words, so I'm not. But the translation that's actually used in the production was Riyad Masawi's translation, who was the director and translator responsible for that production in Ramallah in 2008.
Strange.
Are you volunteering your services to?
I don't mind.
well, it's the difference between intellectually stimulating and stimulating, right?
Yeah.
It's like, that's kind of the difference between, do we have one final question, comment? Anyways, thank you very much. This was a wonderful panel, and if you haven't seen the play,